Annie Layton, a qualified professional supervisor, coach and consultant. She has a heart to champion leaders based on 30 years of experience as a senior pastor and church planter. She provides a safe space for leaders to find clarity, breakthrough and growth in both their personal and professional worlds. She understands the complexities of ministry and meets daily with ministers from around the nation. Here is Annie Layton.
Annie, people think that they're the only ones who feel like an imposter. What have you discovered?
What I've discovered is that everybody seems to have this little secret fear of being an imposter. And I'm always curious when I talk to someone who I think is so good at what they do, and I think, surely not you. And then you just scratch behind the surface and they go, yeah, sometimes I wonder whether I've got the goods from what I'm doing. It's quite a fascinating, condition of humanity. And I think if we look at where it comes from, it's this sense of shame that we're born with, this sense of not enough and not being good enough. And as we go through life, we're trying to curate ways to make ourselves feel better, to find our identity. But it's a tough place to be in because we've got this underlying, narrative that sits with us. It's just as human beings, because we know our brokenness, we know our failings, we know the things that we struggle with. And therefore, they kind of sit low level underneath us when we are trying to form our identity and, deliver on what we're called to do.
How have you seen that play out in your life, Annie?
Yeah, so I think what I've seen, for myself to start with, I think I've been aware of this dynamic that it's a temptation when we've got that residing in us that we're not enough or not good enough, a temptation to try and perform, to try and affirm that deep-seated thing that I'm not good enough or that I'm an imposter. So in my own world, I've had that dynamic of if I try really hard, I'm really excellent in what I do and I look right and act right and perform and just be my best, that somehow that'll make me feel like I'm enough, that I have all the shoulds. Talk about we should all over ourselves, that I should be this and I should be that, and it gives you this sense of trying to be what you're not. So there's a temptation in that to compare with others as well. So when you compare with others, as I say, it's a killer of joy. So I find myself in that place of wanting to compare because I think, well, I'm going to rate how good I'm going based on someone else. So therefore I compare with other people and then give myself almost an internal score, like, oh, well, I'm not as good as that therefore, but I'm better in this. And so it creates this horrible dynamic where we compare it with other people because in ourselves we don't ultimately feel like we're enough. Or the other thing that can happen with that is we feel critical of others. It can be easy to criticise because we're trying to figure out how we place beside them. Are we as good as them, or are we not as good as them? So rather than celebrating other people's successes, it can be very tempting to want to compare ourselves instead in our quest to feel better about ourselves, rather than going to the source of identity. And for me, I'm actually a Christian, so I believe that the source of identity for me is to go back to who God says I am. So rather than finding out who I am through what I do, and that being who I am, I go directly to the source. And I believe as a Christian that God tells me who I am, and as his daughter, because I believe he's my heavenly father, that I get my identity and sense of self from him. And I feel like with him, I'm enough because he is enough. So that's where I go on that journey. But there's a real tyranny of the temptation to compare, be critical, all the shoulds, which is where I can find I've gone myself in the past.
How does that impact your work?
Well, I think with work, I'm a coach and supervisor and mentor and consultant. It's very hard to take that same need to be good at everything, to feel good about myself, into what I do for work. So when I'm doing work, there's this space of I'm listening to somebody and I want to do the best I can do. So it's easy for me to go into the craft of coaching and the craft of listening, trying to be skilled. And when I listen with an ear to what I can do next better and how I can be the best coach possible and what tool have I got and what are they doing, what's the technique, I stop being present. So in my work, I've had to learn to, in my quest to be authentic and trust that I do know what I'm doing, is to stop trying and just know that I'm enough. So when it comes to my work, I just sit back and I just stay present. I think, okay, I know enough. I've got tacit knowledge here. So I'm just going to be present with the client right now and listen. And sure enough, something magically comes out of my mouth that seems to be okay, if not good. And it's because I've stopped trying to be good enough and I just sat back and let my tacit knowledge appear. And I'm just present. And when I'm present, God can work in those sessions as well. So I've had to just get off the treadmill of trying too hard and just like white knuckling my sessions and just go relax, calm down, just be present. And when I'm present, God just works through me, and I'm a way better coach and way more skilled in what I do. Trusting that I am enough. It's all in there, what they call tacit knowledge. It's all in there, and just trust that it'll come out at the right time.
How can we mitigate the imposter syndrome in our lives?
I think there's a few ways you can do it. One way is to put yourself in a really uncomfortable place of being a learner. And I mean, who hates that, right? No one wants to be in a situation where the dummy in the class or the beginner in the class or something. But it's a really great way of you learning to stop putting your identity on what you do and back on who you are. So learning a new skill is really good. And I found that hard. When I studied recently, a few years ago, there were times when I was studying because I was new in the class, I'd put my lid down and burst into tears. I'm just like, I can't do it, it's too hard, and I get feedback and I wasn't good enough on what I was doing, but it was so good for me. Putting myself as a beginner in a situation, because I just went, I'm not what I do. Who I am is a daughter of God. Another thing I was just telling a client about today, I did this thing called the Camino de Santiago, and I walked across Spain. It took me 31 days. And I was not a hiker. And it was tough. I started with blistered feet. I got there, I already had blistered, like my feet puff up when I fly. So after 36 hours on a plane, my feet were like elephant feet, right? So I arrived in France, because you start in France and you go across. My feet were huge. I had blisters. I wasn't a very good hiker. But there's a saying on the Camino that a bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. And that's a Camino saying. And so often on the Camino, everyone would be flying past me and I'd be just like, going, oh, I'll see you in 3 hours, But that putting myself as a beginner, where my ego got smashed, but my soul enlarged, was so good for me, because again, it went back to, it's not what I do, it's not who I am. Who I am is what God says about me. So doing something new you've never done before is really good. I think too, also asking for feedback and putting yourself in a place to receive feedback. I think when we're performance junkies, we can be scared of feedback because it speaks to that core fear of us that we're not good enough. So if someone offers us feedback, we almost have a confirmation bias, like, oh yeah, I knew I wasn't good enough. They've just said that, and it fuels this story we tell ourselves that we're not enough. So inviting feedback, asking for feedback really sorts you out when you're someone that feels like you're an imposter, because you begin to, again, detach what you do from who you are. And feedback's a gift, and you learn and you grow, and you do get better at your skill anyway. Again, remembering that's not what you are, it's what you do. And thirdly, I think it's just having compassion for myself and kindness to myself. And that's the greatest thing to do when you are in that space of struggling with being an imposter. I have to remind myself quite often on a monthly basis, Annie, be kind to yourself. You did the best you could do today, and that's enough. Have compassion for yourself. As good as you were on that day was as good as you were, or whatever. If you've made a mistake, you made a mistake. Tomorrow's fresh with no mistakes. Kindness and compassion to yourself was a big key for getting over the imposter syndrome.
And we end our podcast with 2 questions. Question 1, if you could live your life over again, what is one thing that you would do differently?
I think one thing I do differently is quite a practical, pragmatic one. I went straight from school to Bible college to being a pastor on staff at a church. And in my head, I felt like my sphere of influence to bring change to people around me was to do that through a church model. And I was also at the same time applying for universities to do study in a secular environment. And I sort of threw all that away and went, no, I'm going to work in the church. And I realised later on that I really cut off my options of impact for a broader marketplace by narrowing myself into one particular sphere. And again, that was probably also informed by this thing of, oh, I'm good enough to do church because I know church, and maybe I'm not good enough to be a psychologist or something else. And look, life's turned out brilliantly. I've had a fantastic career in ministry and what I do now. But I think for me, I would think broader and trust myself more at that stage to go, you can do other things. You are good enough to do other things. So it speaks again to this whole topic of the imposter syndrome. So that would be the one thing I do differently.
And our final question today, what is one key message that you could give us today that our listeners could apply practically in their lives this week?
Well, if I stay on the topic of the imposter syndrome, I would say the one thing to remember is you do deserve a seat on the table. You're not an imposter, you're a beginner. and that's okay. That would be my one bit of advice.
Thank you so much for your time, Annie.
You're welcome.